Good morning and welcome to the 26th meeting in 2013 of the Finance Committee of the Scottish Parliament. And could I first of all remind everyone present to please switch off any mobile phones or other electronic devices. Our first item of business today is to take evidence from Barry White and Peter Reekie of the Scottish Futures Trust as part of our scrutiny of the draft budget 2014-15. And can I please welcome our witnesses and invite one of them to make a brief opening statement.
Thank you, Convener and members. Thank you for the introduction. I'm Barry White, the Chief Executive of the Scottish Futures Trust, and I'm accompanied today by Peter Reekie, the Finance Director of the Scottish Futures Trust, and also the Senior Management Team member responsible for the NPD programme. I'm delighted to be back here after our previous evidence, and thank you very much for the invite to be here. We have submitted quite a detailed paper, and I'm very happy to talk through any elements of that paper as we go through the meeting. By way of introduction, I would like to just stress three separate things. One of our key driving forces is investing in the right thing. Obviously, the government decides overall prioritisation, but us working with local authorities, health boards, are very much about making sure that the scope of that individual project is right. We're going through a period of change, building on early work and community health partnerships, for example. We're now seeing a lot of health and social care integration and joint facilities being developed. And the work that both health boards and local authorities are putting in to make sure that those joint facilities are developed in a way that's going to support public services, I think, is a really strong feature of public service in Scotland. We are ambitious as a country, I think, in the delivery of schools and health projects. And what we have done through the HUB programme and our wider work in asset management is establish a mechanism of cooperation that allows impetus now to be built, which I think is a key opportunity. Of course, this takes time, and in both ours and many procuring authorities' early estimates of project development, the time to develop projects has taken longer in cases than we had first anticipated. And in many cases, we had assumed that more work had been done prior to the projects coming on to the NPD programme. So that's the first thing in terms of getting the right thing. The second one is we see a key driver of SFT's activities in increasing investment. And beyond the NPD programme, tax incremental financing, where about £5 million worth of public works will take place this year. But more importantly, it's the private sector investment that unlocks. We also will have something like £58 million worth of investment through the National Housing Trust. And again, that unlocks private investment. So, for instance, in Dundee, 99 houses being sold to the National Housing Trust has unlocked a development of 200 houses, with the private sector developing the other 101 houses and selling or renting those in the private market. So unlocking, through public sector investment, private sector investment is a key driver. And within the NPD programme itself, some of the projects we're working on are of incredible strategic importance. Inverness College is a key feature of a Highlands and Islands enterprise-backed business park in Inverness, and for them being able to show potential new tenants around a business park where a college is being built rather than being talked about is actually a major positive. And major road schemes such as the M8 and AWPR are of incredible strategic economic importance, and one is in procurement at a preferred bidder, one in the earlier stages of procurement. The commitment to those projects is having a positive effect in itself. And one of the critical differences in NPD is that the money follows the project. And within our profiling, we've always been very clear that the profile depends on project progress, as I described in our last evidence to you. And the third thing, just in finishing, we see part of our role in SFT as challenging the status quo. We don't use historic benchmarks or situation normal historic performance or situation normal as a benchmark. We're incredibly challenging with our public sector partners and set ambitious timelines. And we set out in our submission the reasons for movement in the pipeline, but highlight some of the recent comments made by the Construction Procurement Review. And what they said was, we believe that it is in everyone's best interests to make as much information available as possible and to be as open as possible about the status of plans for any given project. This will mean that published plans change. Industry is pushing for this information, and if the public sector is to make it available, industry and its representatives must not only accept the risk that it's subject to change, but also recognise the danger that unreasonable criticism of such change would likely reduce that information flow. And I think in many ways in the NPD pipeline, we've led the way within the public sector in that transparency in publishing pipeline information. And as a result of that, we are getting great competition in the NPD projects and in the NPD pipeline. We're attracting great competition, great financing, and achieving great value for money. And I think also within that, the changes we've made to the structure are providing much greater flexibility for public sector users in the future as well. So just in closing, as you can see from our submission, the confidence behind the profile, with 84% of the projects by value now past the initial approval stage or outline business case compared to only 38% when we last did the profile, gives greater certainty. It doesn't give us 100% certainty, but does give us greater certainty. The timescales remain challenging, but I'm very pleased that the first three projects, major projects in the NPD pipeline, Inverness College, Glasgow College, and the M8 preferred bidder, are all progressing in line to be open and up and running at the date first mooted when they did their outline business case. So with 1.9 billion of projects now in procurement or hub development, we're working very closely with hard-working local teams. We do have challenges in terms of timing, in terms of planning processes, which do take time in certain cases, land acquisition. But on the industry side, design work is sustaining significant numbers of high-quality jobs in advance of construction starting, and the economic value of that isn't really reflected in our pipeline numbers. So I'm very proud of the team in SFT. I'm very proud of the way NPD is progressing. We are keen to make as quick progress as we can, but it's important to progress with the right project and to make sure the investment is there for the long term in its fullest sense. So I'm very happy now to pass back to you, Convener.
Thank you very much, Barry, and of course I'll ask some opening questions, then I'll open up the session to colleagues around the table. Barry, I mean, your paper points out that you've had some £503 million of savings made to the public purse, which I think is a very significant and indeed genuine achievement that SFT has been able to deliver. But you're not concerned that that has been continually overshadowed by overestimation of what is going to be delivered in terms of any given year, in terms of projects on the ground. I mean, for example, you point out that SFT recognises there's been a significant reduction in anticipated capital investment through the NPD programme in both 2013-14 and 14-15. Across these 2 years, there's a 24% reduction. And you go on to say this isn't a reduction in the programme overall, but the capital profile has moved out of time. But if you actually look at it from 2012-13 to 14-15, you know, the difference isn't 24%, but some 33%, some £476 million. When you're actually setting these targets in terms of budgets, do you not believe you're being over-ambitious and leaving yourself open to some of the criticism we saw in Gavin's press release, for example, that came out yesterday? And you go on to say that some NPD projects have been concluded at lower cost. So first of all, could you answer that initial question about being over-ambitious in terms of what you put in the budget? But you also say some projects are taking longer to be prepared and planned. Can you tell us how much difference is due to lower cost and how much difference due to projects taking longer to be prepared and planned?
Just to take the general question first of all, if I could, in terms of the benefits we deliver. So, for instance, in the National Housing Trust, where under the initial phases of that, we have 1,009 homes contracted for. Some 450 of those are occupied. In Inverness, there were 20 people applying to rent every home. In Edinburgh, there were 6 people applying to rent every home. So huge demand for affordable homes. £150 million worth of housing delivered without any grant subsidy is a major achievement. That flows through to our benefit statements. And in terms of the 500 million of benefits, And I think for those people who now have high-quality housing, they have affordable rents, they have much lower energy costs as well, and a professional landlord, the benefits of SFT's work are very readily seen by those people. I think in the NPD programme, the work we have done in simplifying the NPD process will bear fruit for many, many years. Last night I had the privilege of addressing the cross-party group for sport, and there were many sporting bodies in the audience, and one of the issues raised was that in older PFI PPP contracts that public access was really quite a challenge in many cases. And our simplification of NPD and the work that the local authorities, for instance, are doing within the communities is actually making sure that this investment will provide not just good schools, but really good community facilities as well. And I think that that work, while it has taken longer than we had anticipated, and actually longer than the local authorities had anticipated, so we are working with them, but they themselves have suggested timescales and then actually haven't been able to meet them in some cases. But that work, I think, will bear fruit in the long run, and what we will end up with is more sustainable investment in terms of getting the right project that's really going to support not just the public service of education, for instance, but also local community use as well. In terms of specifics of, can I split the movement between cost savings and the preparation time, I don't have a specific split. If you take an example of a particular school in North Lanarkshire, working with the council, the school roll has been adjusted downwards, and that's meant a redesign of that school. Now, partly that's a preparation time addition, so that's extra preparation time, but actually it's also a cost saving in that without that revision to the school roll, there was a risk that a school that was too big could have been built. So in terms of, there's not necessarily a neat split between the two. I would say overall, though, the balance is very much that it is longer preparation time is very much the greater part of the issue that has changed the profile rather than confirmed cost savings.
I mean, as I said, initially, I do think, that you have made genuine significant savings to the public purse. I think the real issue for me, and I'm sure other colleagues around the table, is that there is a consistent overestimation of what will be delivered in a specific year. I mean, for example, in 2012-13, it was estimated that it would be £353 million delivered in projects. A year later, within that year, it would be £20 million. And I think it's that differential that we are concerned about, because, as you point out in your conclusion under Section 6, you say the complex development of increasingly multi-user and multi-authority facilities progress, land and stakeholder consultation issues are resolved and projects are procured and financed in an ever-changing environment. And I know it must be very frustrating for you. I mean, my own constituency, there's a SFT project that's going to be delayed a year because, one of the landowners is trying to maximise the amount of income we can get from the local authority, and that's not your fault. But surely you must be aware of such difficulties when making projections. And yet every year, when you come to the committee, there always seems to be this huge imbalance between what you think will be delivered in a specific year and what is actually delivered in that year. And so what it means is that the achievements that you're actually delivering are being obscured by that particular issue.
I think to take that point, I suppose there's two answers I would give to that. One is that we were always clear that it did depend on project progress. The pipeline information we've put out there has been incredibly helpful in terms of drawing competition into the market, which is providing great value for money. And we give an example in our paper where within one local authority, and it is the case in others as well, where a school announced in 2010 or given revenue funding in 2010 or NPD funding, and one given funding in 2012 will progress through and both open at the same stage. So even within one local authority, it is hugely different speeds of progress. Now that's in part because, I've set out the reasons, but it is in part because of a listed building, a decision to move a primary school on. So I think in some ways that what I would really applaud is the local authority thinking that's going on, because by actually deciding to put a primary school alongside a secondary school, it means that primary school can share the sports facilities or the dining hall, and actually in the long run that will actually save money and be of benefit to both the local authority and to the school. So in doing that asset planning, yes, it causes a delay, and that can be frustrating, not just for us, but for the local authority as well. But it is better to do that and work within the planning framework to get that project through as quickly as possible. But having done the consultation and moving a primary school and working out what to do with the listed building, so there's definitely a balance between those two competing priorities, I suppose, in some ways, speed and actually making sure we get the right thing. And I think it was better sitting here explaining that we're ambitious for the programme than to be back here in 2 or 3 years' time explaining why we have built the wrong thing somewhere and it's not being used to its fullest extent.
I mean, that's, I'm not... It's not really the point I'm trying to make. The point is that, if you say you're going to deliver 500 million in 1 year, but you only deliver 400 million, questions are going to be asked. Whereas if you say you're going to deliver 300 million and it's 400 million, it looks like a tremendous success. The same amount is being delivered on the ground. But what I'm trying to emphasise, continue emphasising, is why are your projections so over-ambitious given all the complexities that we clearly see in these individual projects? That's the kind of thing, because that's why, every year you will get criticism, or the Scottish Government will get criticism in the Chamber, whatever, when we have these debates on this issue. And that's the kind of thing I'm trying to pin down. There seems to be every year an over-ambition in terms of what you think will happen in a given year, and then it turns out that's not delivered. And we know that the project will be delivered, but it will not be delivered the year you say it will be delivered in. And I think what we're looking for in the Finance Committee is a greater level of accuracy in terms of these projections. And just another point I want to make before I open it up to colleagues is that in terms of 12-13, when will we have the figures available for what is actually going to be what will have been delivered in 12-13? We know that in the draft budget of 12-13 it was suggested that 353 million would be delivered. A year later in the draft budget it was suggested that 20 million would be delivered. But when will we know what has actually been delivered in that financial year?
We know that in that year there was, between NHT and so National Housing Trust and NPD, there was something in excess of 30 million delivered. What I don't have with me today is there's 30 million of additionality. What I don't have with me today is the split between NPD and National Housing Trust, but I could submit that to the committee in writing. That would be helpful.
Fine, thanks. But you understand the point I've made 2 or 3 times already, which is about the over-ambition in terms of the projections that you're putting in terms of delivery of these timescales, given all the issues and complexities and difficulties we have. And surely it would be better for SFT if you were somewhat more cautious in your projections of delivery in a given year.
I understand the point you're making.
Doesn't mean you shouldn't be ambitious and push things forward on the ground, but in terms of what you're telling us and the Scottish Government, you should be a bit more cautious, if in fact, because all it looks as if the projects are not being delivered as they should be. That's how it looks to the layperson.
I'll make 2 quick points and maybe just pass on to Peter, because the result of the ambition we've shown is that once projects get into procurement, in Inverness, 17 months to financial close, in Glasgow, 21 months to financial close, on the M8, something like 24 months is the target, and the historic norm for these sort of projects is something like 35 months. So by being ambitious and by driving hard, we are pushing people to outperform against historic norms. Now, one of the great dangers of opting for the much safer approach is actually you set a timetable of 2.5 years for something, and so the Inverness procurement, for instance, we set a timetable of 2.5 years, it would still be just finishing its procurement now rather than on-site and being built. So the ambition we have does drive people hard and fast to outperform against the historic norms. So there's a benefit to ambition, I think, as well. And the reaction we have from industry to that is actually very positive, because there was a Partnerships Bulletin conference held in Edinburgh recently, and the managing director of one of the investment companies from Carillion compared the M8 procurement in Scotland to hospital procurement in England. Now, they were a losing bidder on the M8, so they were unsuccessful. They said every deadline was met, we knew what was happening, and the process was run very well. The hospital in England, the process drifted, and we actually spent a lot more in our bid budget because the process drifted. So working with public bodies by setting that ambition, making sure the resources are right in the project, we're actually achieving significant success in the procurement phase in outperforming historic norms. Peter,
I think that's the point. It would be entirely possible for us to project a set of dates that we think things are going to happen, or that we are targeting for things to happen, and then make if you like, a below-the-line risk adjustment to say, but that might not happen, we could reduce it by 25%. That wouldn't be helpful for all of the people that are trying to drive these projects forward on the ground, and the bidding community that want to know the actual dates where we are targeting for things to happen and what's going to happen in that project. If we were to make a below-the-line adjustment, you would still see the dates that we're driving to, and those dates would still not in all cases be met. But having those targets set that everyone is working to is delivering activity sooner than if we had set slack targets, as Barry said, based on historic norms. And that's what we are really trying to do, is deliver the right project in as rapid a timescale as possible, consistent with going through all of the processes. And if we were to plan for the worst case planning, the worst case land acquisition in every single case, then history shows that where those worst cases didn't occur, we would not claw back as much time as we have based on the ambitious targets that have been set.
There's a balance to be struck. This is what Gavin said in his press release yesterday. He said, and I quote, "We previously knew that things were moving far more slowly than trumpeted, but today we learn that a mere 4 projects out of 49 are under construction. This failing is harming our economy too, especially given how much the construction sector has suffered in recent years. If the Scottish Government could get moving on these projects, it would create thousands of extra building jobs in Scotland." So how would you respond to that? Seeing as he's here and this is what's probably in today's papers.
I think with the everything we do in additionality, what we call additionality, which is National Housing Trust, tax incremental financing, and NPD, is all about expanding investment in the economy. And there are other bits of government through the regulated asset base, through surplus asset sales, through transfer of revenue budget to capital, that as a whole are all making a massive impact in terms of allowing investment to continue. So I think it's a part of a cohesive effort within the whole Scottish Government family. In terms of jobs, from part of my introductory remarks, the National Housing Trust, housing is one of the best ways in terms of actually helping skills and jobs. And the National Housing Trust, both through directly sourced affordable housing and through the knock-on effects, is having a very significant positive impact on jobs. And what we're already seeing in the construction industry and the trade bodies in the construction industry are now, Scottish Building Federation, through their construction monitor, have now started to talk about a potential skills shortage. So, it has been a very tough time for the construction industry throughout the recession, and the shortage of bank finance has not helped that in terms of private development. And what we're now seeing is a pickup in the construction industry, and NPD, NHT and tax incremental financing are a significant part of that.
Do you think it's a failing that is harming our economy?
I think everything we do in additionality is helping our economy.
Sorry, can I add? The impact of these projects on the economy of Scotland spans a much greater time period than the construction. The construction of a physical asset is possibly 10–20% of its cost in terms of its maintenance and the activities that happen within it over its lifetime. The most important thing for the economy of Scotland is to get that project, the right project, to be used well and deliver services or deliver the economic benefits of the correct road layout, etc., over its lifetime. And that's what the economy needs most of all. The shorter run impact on jobs during the construction phase, as Barry said, is being delivered through the additionality to, over the whole life of the asset, a marginally different timescale than was originally envisaged.
Okay. I think we might dispute the word marginally at some point as we go forward, but I want to let colleagues in at this point, and the first person to ask questions will be Jamie, to be followed by Jean.
Thank you, Convener. I'm sure Gavin's delighted to know someone's reading his press releases. I want to pick up on the issue of timescale that the Convener mentioned in the summary of your very helpful paper. You refer to most projects having passed the outline, business case or initial approval stage, which audits Scotland recognised programme certainty to be good enough to track movement against, and that meaning there is greater certainty around the construction profile. And in section 4 you talk about this a little more. You say at the time of the 13-14 draft budget only 38% of projects by value passed the initial approval stage, and now 84% by value are past that stage, giving increased certainty of timetable. I have to say that sounds very impressive, but without really knowing what that actually means on a practical level, it's hard to assess whether or not it is impressive. Can you tell us, what that means on a practical level, and why this increases the certainty of timetable?
I will give an initial answer. Peter might well jump in. Feel free to do so, Peter. But the 38% moving to 84% is taking projects out of that initial development stage, and the initial approval stage that we talk about is also called the outline business case stage, and that's the stage at which a health board in effect signs off the project for the first time. It takes it to the Scottish Government for approval through a committee that looks at all the capital investment, and it is that stage where there is normally sufficient information to say this is the timetable for that project and this is the budget for that project. And when Audit Scotland have audited Scottish Government capital programmes and local authority capital programmes, the initial approval outline business case stage is the bit that they normally use as one of their data points to say, is this project on budget and on time? The second stage that they use is the final business case, which is just before construction starts normally. So the initial approval is just before procurement starts, and the final business case final approval is just before construction starts. So by having 84% of the projects in that categorisation, that means now that bodies are committed through an approval to a timetable that they're now working to. So when we published our earlier pipeline, we're working with much less certain information. That's back to the quote I gave from the Construction Procurement Review. It's better to publish a pipeline, but to accept that it may well change, but to put the information out there. And what we're now working with when in updating the capital profile is a much greater degree of certainty.
Yeah, I mean that, just to expand on those timescales, that outline business case stage where it's generally reckoned that there is a good degree of certainty of delivery to measure against, can happen weeks or a couple of months before a project is put to the market as a procurement. The industry needs a lot more forward knowledge of a project coming than that in order to plan its business properly. So if we were overly concerned about certainty before we publish information, we would say nothing about the timing of a project, or indeed its likely cost, until that stage, the outline business case stage, the initial approval, when that certainty is generally recognised to be at a good level. Our judgment is that the importance of giving the transparency to industry and others that the project is coming outweighs the higher degree, as we've seen, of uncertainty of providing that information early on.
Okay, that's quite helpful. I seem to recall when you were before the committee, you made this point at the time, and I think one of us asked, but I'm going to ask again anyway. In your conclusion, you say the NPD programme is one of the largest of its type in Europe. Again, that's very impressive, but can you put that in some form of context for us?
The comparison we gave and the European information is available on financial close data, so the number of contracts you sign and the value of those in any year, and the average across Europe is something like £30 per person per annum or something of that order. Within Scotland, over the next 3 years, we're going to be going at a rate of something like 5 times that, so it's around 4 to 5 times the European average. And France, when they had a similar programme of major investment, was averaging about £90 per annum per person of financial clues. So that's where the comparison comes from. So there's a very major investment programme that is allowing these very important projects to progress whenever capital is short. And I think that's really the big underlying point. It's why France did it. It's why the Netherlands is doing something not quite at the same scale, but on a per head basis, but a very significant programme, is to offset the shortage of capital and have these very important projects progressing.
And do you have some form of table that can graphically illustrate that? Or?
We could do a very brief summary of that and send it to the committee if that would be helpful.
I think it'd be interesting, it'd be helpful for I mean, certainly back up the point. Well, hopefully it'll back up the point that you're making in the paper and you have in response to my question. We've also talked a lot about the jobs that can be created through the process of construction and indeed procurement. And Mr White talked about the high quality jobs at both stages. And I did pick up, I think you said it wasn't necessarily possible to quantify that, but I mean, I'm wondering why that's the case, and if you're attempting to quantify how many jobs are being supported through the process of procurement and construction.
The point I was making earlier was that if you take a project like the M8 as an example, if it was capitally funded, all the design costs that are, at this moment in time, there's a whole team of designers working up the absolute final designs for that project, allowed to go on site and start construction. Under a capital, if it was a capital project, the government would be paying for that out of its capital budget. The way it works in NPD is the private sector pay for that and then recoup it at financial close. So, so they fund that out of their own resources, and the government doesn't start paying for a project until it's actually finally built and open. So the point I'm making is that, right across this project at the moment, in addition to the construction work that's on site that we have put into the capital profile, there's a very significant amount of design work, right across the projects that would normally be funded through capital, but in this case isn't. Now, we haven't quantified that in terms of putting a number on it, but it is design costs are a sizable element of the overall project costs.
Okay. So there's an example I could use perhaps of that. That brings in why the timing is so critical to these figures in a way. That we have a project, the Forest, Woodside and Tain Health Centres, which is in the programme at £13.6 million, and probably around about 7% of that value is in the design costs that would have occurred over the year prior to reaching financial close. So that project closed in the first week of April of this financial year. So 98% of its value in our pipeline is in this financial year. If you showed up at the site in Tain during March, you would have seen people on the site doing pre-works that were related to that project. Now, it would be pretty complicated for us to allocate the individual value of the individual people on the site prior to the financial close. So we use that date as the starting point for our estimate. if you turned up in the offices of Kepi designers or Halliday Fraser Monroe architects across Scotland, for the year prior to that start on site, you'd have seen people busy with their jobs designing those buildings in Scotland.
Okay, well,
So,
I mean, I suppose the point I make, though, is if you can see them, you can count them. So, you know, is there an attempt to try and quantify the number of jobs? I mean, we're talking about the value, and I understand why that's important, but also in terms of the number of people that are being supported in employment through the NPD projects. I mean, is there an attempt at doing that? I would have thought there would have been.
There's an attempt at a global level to say, you know, every £100 million worth of work supports a certain number of jobs, and that uses sort of standard government sort of metrics. So that is something we look at a global level. I think the point Peter's making is that within our capital profile, there are things happening out with that capital profile that are generating jobs and economic activity, and that's the bit that we, again, could attempt to put a global figure around, but it would be a high-level estimate. It could never be that precise, because all you could do is say, well, actually, 5% of a project will be spent before financial close. Or, you know, we need to look.
I mean, I should say, I don't think we're looking for their name and national insurance
Yeah.
number. I mean, a high-level estimate would probably, you know, be okay.
Yes.
So, you know, if you haven't got that now, then maybe it's something that could be helpful
We
for,
can very easily
for
provide.
the committee. One last question. This is the most important question I'm asking, convener. Certainly from my perspective, can you tell us about the Education Schools Phase 3 project? Is that still on time? And by Education Schools Phase 3, I mean, is Greenfalls High School in my constituency going to be on time?
I could respond directly. I cannot say I know the precise details of Greenfalls. I know that Greenfalls and Clydebank High School, or Clyde Valley High School, sorry, my mistake, Clyde Valley High School are joined together in one project, are active in procurement right now. And so that's one of the examples I sort of would give is Clyde Valley High School was one that was known about for a couple of years before Greenfalls was added, and they're now advancing very much together. And the economies of scale that gives us actually a very welcome value for money addition in some ways. And but I could come back on the specific timetable on Greenfalls. Be happy to do that.
Thank you.
Thank you, convener. I want to just follow on a topic that I started, I think, the last time you were here, which is about procurement. And on page 4 of the document that we have from you, in the Forest Woodside Tane bundle, there's a reference made to 55 individual work package opportunities, and 85% by value of the work has been awarded to Scottish small and medium-sized enterprises. Is that, are we now looking at breaking some of the contracts down into smaller packages? Is that the inference here, or is that actually what's happening? I mean, I'm sure every member of the committee has been, you know, lobbied at some point by small contractors and people who found the procurement process really, really difficult. I guess my question is it getting easier ahead of procurement bill or whatever? And is this relevant to change, or is this the same old, same old?
I think it's a really good example of good practice, what I would say. So what we're doing is within the construction contract, there'll be a number of works packages, and that will be groundworks, or it'll be the block work for the walls, or there'll be a foundations package or a steel erection package. And it is those packages that were actually, through the hub procurement route, which TN Forest and Woodside was procured through, there's a huge set of key performance indicators sitting around that to make sure that small and medium enterprises do have a fair chance to bid for those works packages. So what we're highlighting here is the outcome of that. So saying within that project, the intention has been honoured in terms of not only have been given the opportunity to price the works packages, which is the first commitment, but actually in this case, a very high percentage of them have been awarded them as well. So I think it is a good example of good practice in advance of the procurement reform bill, and I think the procurement reform bill can build on that.
So it's a good example here, but it's not necessarily I mean, it's happening everywhere. I mean, has there been some particular practice that has made this a reasonably high percentage going to small and medium-sized enterprises, or would that compare very favourably with other bundles, if you like, or groups of work? I mean, we don't have anything to compare that with, so I'm just wondering if this is exceptional, which is why you've highlighted it in the paper.
I think it is.
Or are we moving towards that more? Is it generally accepted as an issue to be dealt with?
It is generally accepted as an issue to be dealt with, and that's why in the hub procurement route there are the key performance indicators around percentage of opportunities offered to SMEs. So, and we've also done some studies on some of the conventionally procured schools through the Scotland Schools for the Future programme, which I'd be very happy to submit to the committee separately. I don't have those with me today, but I'd be very happy to submit those to the committee for 2 of the schools that were procured conventionally. But there's a huge emphasis across the public sector now, whether it's in hub or elsewhere, to try to ensure that small and medium enterprises are given the opportunity. It is not giving them the work on a plate, and neither should it, but it's certainly making sure they have the opportunity. The hub in particular, as part of the bidding process, the partners we work with in hub offered very significant commitments in terms of what they would offer to SMEs. So one of the advantages we have in a procurement route such as hub is it is a long-term ongoing partnership at which giving opportunities to SMEs is a key element. And from that point of view, we're seeing it across the hub programme that that's the case. Now, in even the larger projects, and we give some example of the work done in Glasgow with Glasgow College, which I might ask Peter maybe just speak about a little, but there the works packages such as mechanical and electrical, which I think is going to Forth Electrical Services, which I don't think qualifies as an SME. I think it's too big now to be an SME, but it's a company that's grown up in Scotland. So some of the work packages there, because of the scale, will go to bigger companies, but again it will trickle down through them to SMEs for some of the specialist elements behind that. But what we've seen in Glasgow is a real commitment to local jobs and local training as Glasgow College. And Peter, do you want to just say something about some of the commitments made?
Yeah. I think to complete on SMEs, one thing that we're seeing now, which I don't think we'd seen to the extent before, is main contractors at the top of the supply chain giving commitments through hub and through our MPD projects to build capacity in the SMEs that are located around the project to help them tender for work packages on the project. So rather than just as an SME showing up cold and having to compete with everyone for the project, the main contractor is looking out there and spending time with the local supply chain to help them tender for work and to help them meet the health and safety requirements, for example, that are inherent in large projects, to work with the big contractors. So on Glasgow, the box there shows there's a significant number, 500 hours of capacity building that the main contractor has promised to help SMEs bid for work on their own project. In Glasgow, it being a college in particular, the Glasgow College procurement team was very, very keen to see their own students in construction and related skills benefiting from the projects itself. And that's not just on the college, but it's particularly so there. And there are commitments, contractual commitments to community benefits, training places, jobs, and graduate places, not just over the construction phase, but also over the 25 years maintenance phase of that contract. So there'll be a minimum of 40 new apprenticeships, for example, and significant new entrant jobs on that project. And that's really driven by 2 things to me. One is the sort of the high level, as Barry's talked about, public sector attention being put on these things, which is absolutely right. But it's also the sort of skill and dedication of the individual champion in every project team. What we've done in the MPD programme is asked one person in the procuring team to be the champion of community benefits. And there's nothing in a competition like hearing someone who you're trying to please on the evaluation team always saying, this is really important to us, you must deliver. And it's not just the high-level policy setting, but it's individual procurement teams, and Glasgow is a really good example, banging on to their tenderers all the time that this will make a difference. And that, I think, is what has delivered such a high level of commitment from the contractor in the Glasgow College project.
Okay, and just on another point, the project in it for Inverness College, which you say was 17 months as compared to an average of 35. I mean, you talked earlier about some of the barriers, so should we assume that some of these were not there? I mean, are there lessons learned from that? Is that an ambition realised, or will we see other projects that can, in the light of everybody talking about the kind of timescales here, what made that so good?
There's a number of things that helped Inverness College to do that so quickly, and actually it is a very fast process given the complexity of the project. The simplification we've brought to the NPD process, and by simplification I mean we've stripped out soft services and a lot of complexity that actually we did partly for speed reasons, but it's actually to let the users have a lot more flexibility as to how they use the building, so it's a really big public service benefit as well. With Inverness, we agreed to second somebody to their project team. So Scottish Futures Trust had a secondee working as part of the project team who'd been through this process or a similar process before. And we set an ambitious timeline for them and worked with them to support them through that ambitious timeline. So the project preparation was good. The college had a strong project director, which is always a key leader, is always important in these projects, and the simplification of the process. And one of the winning bidder, Jeff Jackson, who's the chief executive of Equitix, who was part of the winning consortium, made some very positive comments about how that process, the streamlining, saved both time and money, and actually it compares favourably with the rest of the UK, which I would agree with. So from that point of view, it was leadership, simplicity, and getting the right resources behind the leader as well.
Okay, thank you, Jean. Gavin, to be followed by John.
Thank you, Convener. The Scottish Government produced, as part of the draft budget, Annex B, a table of what the sort of most up-to-date estimated capital profile was for the NPD pipeline. Now that came out obviously fairly early September. Is that still the most up-to-date profile, as it were, or have there been changes in the last, almost 2 months or so?
We have not updated the profile since August. That is the most up-to-date profile. We generally update it once a year. The number of variables against each project are very significant, and what we do throughout the year then is update the pipeline, which sets out when we expect projects to reach financial close. So the interim updates in some ways are in the pipeline document rather than the capital profile.
The convener asked a question earlier in relation to the change to what was predicted for 13-14. I think last year it was, we spoke to us last time, it was going to be 338 million. It's going to be 185 million in terms of the most updated profile. And he asked the question, how much of that change was down to delay, and how much of it was down to lower costing, because those are the two reasons given in the budget document. Now, your response was that, for one example anyway, I think it was a Lanarkshire school, that was quite difficult to give a neat split, because that school was partly down to saving money, partly down to delay. Putting that school to one side, though, I mean, is it possible to give the committee, when you have time to do it, how much of the change from 338 to 185 can we say is down to just things taking longer than anticipated, and how much of it is down genuinely to cost savings? Is that something you would be able to, I mean, I'm not expecting it now, but is it something you would be able to furnish the committee with, even though there might be one or two exceptions to that?
We can certainly give the committee more information on that. I think there are some ambiguities in that, because I think I've given the particular one of the school, but we can give a broader indication of the split between the two. There may be some assumptions or estimates in that for the reasons I've highlighted, but we can certainly do that.
Okay, thank you. Another thing the convener asked was just about the outturn for 12-13. I think the most recent prediction we had was 20 million, but we don't have the outturn. And again, you said you'd give us to that. Just in terms of clarification, is that something that currently exists that you'll be able to give us fairly quickly, or is it something that it might take a few months for the outturn to actually be official, as it were? I'm just trying to anticipate how long. Is that available now, effectively, or is it something that will take a...
We should really give that information quickly. The figure I have with me today is the combined
figure
for additionality, which is National Housing Trust and NPD together.
Sure.
What I don't have is the split of that with me today.
Sure.
So. Okay,
thank you. That's helpful. One question, just purely on clarification. In your paper at page 1, it's a paragraph for summary, third line down. Financial close has been achieved on 267 million of projects, with more than 600 million anticipated by the end of this financial year. Just for clarification, by the end of this financial year, will it be 600 million, or will it be 600 million plus 267 million?
It's, the 267 and the 600 are separate, so there are an additional £600 million worth of projects thereby that are moving towards financial close between now and March.
Okay, so I just wanted to make sure the 267 wasn't included in the... Right, fine. The next question then, on page 2, the end of the sort of fairly large first paragraph ends with some projects still in early development, some risk of further movement remains. I just wonder if you can expand on that slightly with specific reference to the latest prediction for 13-14, which is 185 million, and the latest projection for 14-15, which is 809 million. Can you just expand on your comment of some risk of further movement remains? What do you think will happen to the 185 and the 809? I mean, are they best case scenarios? Are they central scenarios? Are they conservative scenarios? How would you describe them? What sort of movement might we see?
I think what it sets out is an anticipated rate of progress, but if something unexpected should happen, then progress could slow from that. Now, whether that has a big impact this year, sorry, in 14-15, because they're in the projects that are not yet in development are more likely to impact in the following year rather than in the immediate next year.
Okay. So in terms of the 185 then, while nothing is guaranteed, how much of that, what percentage of that 185 do you sort of feel is more or less guaranteed to happen within that financial year?
What we've set out is that sitting behind the figures now is that there's 84% of the projects at that higher degree of certainty. Now, what we also set out in the paper is saying we are seeking financing from international sources. There's all sorts of changes in international banking markets in terms of regulations to make banks safer. So what we do set out saying actually we are anticipating, for instance, a range of projects reaching financial close next July, for instance. Within that, we are very confident, as we sit here today, that financing will be fully available. But I think it would be unwise to say we can predict with any certainty what the financial markets position will be in July next year. So there's a degree of caution in these things because it is not as if all the variables are under our control. So I think what we're saying is we need to have a degree of caution, but what we will be doing is working with local authorities, in the case of the schools I've just highlighted, to really push those schools through and achieve financing at that time. but we are reliant on financing markets as well. Now, we've been very successful to date, and that's where our confidence comes from in terms of achieving the financing. We're achieving financing at competitive costs. We're getting a high degree of financing interest in projects. On Glasgow College, I think we had 4 different financing options, Peter.
We did, yes.
And between pension funds and banks, the European Investment Bank came in, which actually has helped the value for money immensely. So within that all I'm saying is that while we are confident projects can be pushed forward, there are some variables that are there as well.
Okay. Sticking with the 185 then for 13-14, we're obviously pretty close to halfway through the financial year of 13-14. How much of the 185 has happened on the ground in the first half of the financial year?
I don't have that figure to hand, but the timing of the financial closes is such that, for example, the M8 bundle project, which is a very large project and the spend accelerates very quickly, is towards the end of the financial year. It hasn't happened yet. So the level of activity continues to ramp up quite quickly. So there's quite a lot of that remaining to be done, and therefore the year-end point, and exactly at the end of March, how many weeks and months of construction activity on the M8, for example, is included in this financial year is very sensitive.
Is it possible then, fair enough, you don't have the figures now, is it possible to give to the committee, though, roughly what has happened in the first half of the financial year and what is expected for the second half of the financial year? Yes. Yeah, okay. And last question then, just in terms of projects actually under construction, there are currently 4 under construction. Again, without anything being guaranteed. When we get to the end of the current financial year, how many projects do you anticipate in total will be under construction by the end of the financial year?
I think that is really set out in our pipeline document where we put in, which is an attachment to the paper we submitted. So we have in that pipeline document, I think it's a construction start date, it's the phrase we use in that. So that's in effect immediately after financial close for many of these projects. So within that pipeline document, that's all set out in there.
Okay, but roughly what do you think the number will be then?
I don't actually have a number.
Okay, I
think the details there. If you want me to summarise what's in that table, I'm very happy to do that. I think that's something we're very happy to do, is to summarise the table.
Sorry, I wasn't clear if you're saying you're going to summarise it now, or you'll send us a summary. I was just...
Yes, I'll send you...
Right, sorry.
If that's going to be helpful. We thought by providing the whole pipeline, all the information's there, project by project, school by school, health centre by health centre, but we can certainly add it up.
If that's easily done, then fine. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. John, to be followed by Michael.
Thank you, Convener. I think the first question I had, you did talk about, I think, Loch Gilphead and Inverurie, is that right, are being bundled together. They're obviously not quite adjacent to each other physically. So can you explain to us what bundling together means? Is it just the financial side of it?
In effect, yes, would be the simple answer. But what it really means in practice is that one loan is taken out for both projects rather than having separate loans, and one operator will support both the projects and maintain the buildings, but the buildings themselves are absolutely separate buildings that will have health service staff in them, and the only private sector element there will be the maintenance staff who will come and look after the building. But by bundling them together, it means that the financing cost or financeability and the sort of overhead cost of getting a deal done, so the financial transaction cost of getting a deal done, is spread across both projects, which makes it much more cost effective.
Okay, so I understand the financial side, because in a sense it doesn't matter where things are if you're making it one bigger project. I mean, the constructors might be different then for the two different places?
It's entirely possible they could be different. I'm not sure in this case whether they are or not. In that with bundling it, it's still entirely possible that each building can be built by a different person or a different main contractor. It may also be the same contractor building both, because most contractors do have a geographic spread that would cover both areas.
Although quite a lot would be local. I mean, going back to Jean Urquhart's point, that to some extent would disadvantage a local builder in Argyll or something if they had to use an Aberdeenshire builder.
The majority of the work will always be done by local subcontractors. So in terms of the actual physical work on the ground, in terms of what we talked about earlier, the works packages, the vast majority of the work will be done by local contractors.
Right. And that would be true of the maintenance as well then, because you said it would be the same maintenance.
The maintenance, the sort of maintenance providers we see cover, all of the Highlands, so they will have a mixed workforce of specialists who may well come from Inverness or from Aberdeen for specialist things such as lift maintenance, but they will also have local maintenance people on the ground, and then they would use local contractors for particular tasks as well.
Right. So in fact, most of that would not vary depending whether it was the two had been built separately or they were built in a bundle together.
No, that wouldn't change enormously either way.
So the emphasis is really on the financing side of it. That's where the big difference is.
It is on the financing side and that transaction cost of getting it to financial close and up and running.
Right. Okay, thanks. That's helpful. I mean, going back, at the risk of going over the same ground again, to some of the figures. And for example, the draft budget for 12-13, 353 million, and they then revised to 20. Now, am I right in saying that these are the capital expenditures that are going out in these years? They're not related directly to what the public purse is paying. That will happen in the longer term.
Correct. Yes.
Yes.
So Aberdeen Health Village, which will open later this year, the first payment will be made after it opens, so the payment starts from the government once construction is complete.
Yes. Now that obviously then impacts on the budget of that health board or whatever, because they thought they were going to pay the first amount, which might be, what, £10 million or whatever, say in 14-15, but it then pushes it back a year. Is that the practical impact of these slippages? That the individual local authority or the health board, the first payment will be later?
If you do something like the project at Aberdeen Health Village, it is opening pretty much in line with when the health board expected it to, when it did its initial approval and when it did its final approval. So from that point of view, the payment it has to make is pretty much at the same time it would have expected to make it. So it will have budgeted from about 2 years ago with the expectation of a payment being made this sort of Christmas time or early next year, is the first payment being made. And they will also get support from central government as, in effect, the capital cost element of the project will be given to them by central government, as is the case with all the NPD projects going through. And the health board then picks up some of the costs they would have had anyway, such as maintenance. So there's a split of the cost of the project between the health board picking up out of its own budget and some central support.
And that central support is spread over the life of the project, or it all comes at day one?
It's spread over the life of the project.
Yes. So that central support then, the first part of that central support is also delayed by a year if the project slips by a year.
If a project takes longer in preparation and moves back the way, then the first payment would also move back as well.
Yes.
So that's the case. But that would be, in terms of budgeting purposes, people would know when they do the initial approval or outline business case what the likely date of opening is, and therefore that's when people would start to say that's the once we have the initial approval, the budgeted date for the first payment to be made starts to become much more concrete. So that's back to what we were saying earlier about the greater certainty of timetable as projects go past that initial approval stage.
Yes, but The 353 moving to 20 is what? Projects before or after the initial approval stage? Or a mixture?
It'll be a mix, but when we did the previous profile a year ago, or in summer 2012, I think just the charting with 34% of projects past that stage, sorry, 38%, sorry, 37%, my mistake. So those moving into procurement, so we've moved from 37% in that development stage post initial approval to shifting up to 84% now in terms of that. So the budgeting that the government will need to do will be based on the business cases that have now been signed off. So if we take Glasgow College as an example, Glasgow College has a staggered opening. Now, Glasgow College, Peter might know the exact business case date, but it's probably the business case date will have been about 2 years ago, give or take. And for the last 2 years, there's been a planned opening of Glasgow College, which is now the anticipated opening date. So Glasgow College, in terms of how Audit Scotland look at a project, is both on budget and on time from both its initial approval and final approval. And that means...
So for the last 2 years, that's been known, these dates?
Yes, for something like Glasgow College, yes.
So if we stick to it, that's a good enough example. So therefore, anybody budgeting, either the college or the government, they should have known for the last 2 years when they were going to have to start making real cash payments.
Yes. So in terms of government budgeting, as projects move through the initial approval, that's when people start to say we must start to make sure the cash is available in that. You know, it might be in 2016 or 2017 even for some of the roads jobs is quite a way ahead, but that provision would then have to be made in future budgets.
I mean, I think the point I'm trying to get at is, I mean, I take the point that was made earlier that if a building that's going to last for 30 years starts 1 year later, or opens 1 year later and closes 1 year later, in the scheme of things, that doesn't seem to be a big problem. The point I think I'm trying to make is that it is having an impact on this year or next year's budget, because the actual cash being paid for that first year after opening is changing and presumably reducing from what we've heard already. And that money can be used for other things. So I think my fear in this is that every time there's a slippage here, you know, okay, we might end up with a better project, but it's also causing a problem in the short-term budgeting, both for central government and for the local authority or the health board.
When you say short-term, I think Barry's point is that's a little bit further out than you might imagine, because if our average procurement time is just under 2 years, then the outline business case or the initial approval, when we get a great deal more certainty over timescales, is done before the procurement starts. So at that point where there's more certainty, you have, in round terms, 2 years of procurement for a major project, 2 or 3 years of construction before you have to start paying at the start of operations. So we have a good deal of certainty over the end date, maybe 4 or 5 years out from when the budget implication hits. And that's a pretty long planning period for any organisation, not least the Central Scottish Budget, to get its budgets lined up. So there is a good period of very much increased certainty before the revenue budget implication of paying the unitary charges for these projects kicks in.
And in practice, probably the accountant and the health board or the accountant and the local authority is quite happy if the payment's delayed for a year, because that's the way accountants look at things, I suppose. But I mean, I still come back right to the very first point the convener made, I suppose, in that you seem to be saying, or it seems to be said, that this is the kind of maximum right at the beginning. You know, this is the maximum that could be spent or whatever in a particular year. And I just wonder still if there's not a need for saying, well, this is the maximum, and there's a 10% risk that it's this and a 20% risk that it's this, and some kind of more of a spread instead of what seemed to be very definite figures. Now, I mean, I accept the point, if you're going to Crudens or whoever it is, you want to give them specific targets on a specific project. But do you not think, as an overall picture, we need to paint more of a kind of risk analysis or something like that?
We could certainly look at doing more risk analysis around that. The point we've made is that as projects do move into procurement, they do increase in certainty. So from that point of view, where we sit today compared to where we sat with the figures from summer 2012, there is much greater certainty around them. But you are right, it's not 100% certainty.
Okay, thank you.
Michael.
Thanks, Convener. We've been hearing a lot about comparisons between the different types of PFI projects, and the normal comparison is between the NPD form of PFI and the PPP form of PFI. But I wanted to sort of explore the difference between the original types of NPD and the current way that you're doing NPD. When was the first NPD project in Scotland? 2004, 2005, something like that? Was it around that time?
I can't remember the specific dates, but it was of that era. Certainly, Argyll and Bute was the pilot project.
Yeah. So when you're using NPD now, do you compare it to that project in terms of the improvement that's been made in the way that you deliver NPD now?
We haven't done a direct comparison. I happen to work actively on the Argyll and Bute pilot projects. I do know a lot about the original thinking behind it, and I think it was a very good pilot run at the time. There has been significant change. So, for instance, in Argyll and Bute and some of the earlier projects, the surpluses were given to charity rather than rebated back to the public body. So we're now in a position where we can rebate back to the public body, which means there's a direct benefit. So some of the earlier NPD or NPDO projects, as they were called at that time, had to use a charity with a public ethos set up. So I think that's one major improvement. But we've always said within NPD that some of the benefits, like having a public interest director, are exactly the same. So the original NPDO pilot had a public interest director. There also was a stakeholder director in the earlier ones, which we don't need now because there's not because of that sort of charity element disappearing. I think I'm right in saying that, Peter. There's one of the changes, but the biggest change I think we have made is the simplification, which I sort of touched on earlier, by changing the risk profile, the insurance risks, stripping out the services, which has now largely been replicated in the UK government's change to PF2 when they changed away from PFI. A lot of those changes we made in stripping out soft services, changing some of the risk profile. So in comparing back to the NPDO in Argyll and Bute, there have been significant changes made, which I highlighted sort of the biggest ones, but actually we have learned a lot from that pilot, and sort of the knowledge I have personally has been incredibly useful.
Yeah. Something else that I think has changed, and I'm looking for clarification around this. You mentioned earlier the Clyde Valley High School project. Now, my understanding was that was originally part of North Lanarkshire Council's programme of school building, which had already built around 25 or 26 schools. But is it also the case that when those original schools were built, the split between the government resource input and the local authorities was 80-20, and under this project it's 50-50, is that correct?
The last round of PFI PPP had an 80-20 split in it. In many cases, the local authorities did more and topped up a little bit, so the balance shifted away from 80-20, so perhaps they added on extra facilities, or indeed the projects actually went over budget and the government didn't give them any more funding, so they actually had to find that from their own resources. So I think there's a mixed bag out there, but the principle was an 80-20 split, and that was absolutely right. The principle behind the current funding arrangements for secondary schools is a 2/3, 1/3 split, so central government's picking up 2/3 of the cost and local government picking up 1/3. But again, in Clyde Valley High School, for instance, there's a primary school that's part of the site that's not funded from the programme, so the overall split of cost on that project will not necessarily be 2/3, 1/3 because of all the facilities that North Lanarkshire perhaps are putting into the project. But the principle on a school building being built as a standalone building, there should be something around 2/3, 1/3 as the split.
Okay, again, that's helpful. So when you're producing the figures for the project in its totality, does that include the local authorities' share, or is that just the Scottish Government's input into that project when you put it into the budget?
When we put it into our budget, the capital profile we put in is based on the government element of it rather than the total cost. So in terms of a prudent way to look at things, we could argue that it's unlocking local authority investment as well, but we don't. We just say the government element of a project is 2/3, and that's what we count in the capital profile.
In which case, the next question for me is in terms of, for example, the M8 bundle. Is there any local authority input into that project in terms of the cost of delivery? I
know in the AWPR there is contributions to local authority. On the M8, Peter?
On the M8, the unitary charge and the capital costs of the project are completely met by Scottish Government funding through Transport Scotland. But there are plenty of other examples where the MPD programme and the revenue funding that we have has leveraged in funding from other organisations. So the Glasgow College project, for example, if you scan around at look at press articles, for example, on the value of that project, we have that down as £193 million because that is the value of NPD funding into that project. The construction value of the project is around about 228 million because the college is using some of its reserves to fund elements of work, and the Funding Council is putting some additional funds in there as well. So again, 193 million of NPD funding, counted as that in our pipeline document and the figures you have in front of you, has turned into 228 million of construction activity on the ground. So all of these things bring more additionality to the total economy. They're just not highlighted in the way the figures here are done.
Okay. And on health projects, again, thinking locally about some of the investment that's now been announced in Lanarkshire over the past wee while, with some of the business cases have been signed off. A lot of those projects were signed off, or were originally signed off, as was the M8 bundle was signed off by Tavish Scotland, who was Transport Minister in 2006. We still haven't seen the M8 project officially underway yet. I know that the tendering process is virtually complete, but we're not actually at the point where we've started to build the road yet. So it's not started at a time after it was supposed to be completed. Some of the projects that have been announced recently from NHS Lanarkshire, when the original programme under Picture of Health included these primary care projects, again, it was signed off in 2006. The timescale for them was to have them started and completed before now, when only now they're being signed off as business cases. What caused that slippage?
I think there's probably a very... Well, to answer that question, first of all, I can't speak on behalf of NHS Lanarkshire in detail about their specific movement since 2006 to now. At a higher level, I think a shortage of capital is actually the big picture since 2008, 2009 onwards. And that shortage of capital, in the way I described earlier, has led to the Scottish Government transferring revenue to capital, regulated asset base, NPD, NHT, TIF, looking at all these different means of bringing in additional investment. So I think the simple answer would be a shortage of capital. What I don't know is whether there are other factors in health and social care now planning together, or whether there's other factors in terms of some of the thinking being revisited. I really don't know that. And I wasn't in the public sector in 2006. I don't know the background of those projects at that time. But I suppose the simple fact is, with shortage of capital, the NHS Lanarkshire bundle, as we call it, there's a number of projects, would probably have to wait many years before capital became available. And what the NPD money is allowing to do is to go ahead very shortly because of the NPD funding. So I think that's the positive, really, that comes out of that.
Yeah, except that the Wishaw Centre and the Hunter Health Centre in East Kilbride were both announced to be delayed in 2007, before the capital investment dried up with the credit crunch?
I would hate to sort of be seen to wash my hands of the issue, but nor was I in the public sector in 2007, so I can't say for certain. But the decisions that were made then I can't really answer for. What I do know is, in terms of the NHS Annexure bundle, it's making good progress through procurement. We're keen to get it to financial close as quickly as possible and get those health centres built. And that will be one of the projects we're seeking to move forward as quickly as possible at the moment. You're quite right in the M8, it's at a very advanced stage of procurement. There's a lot happening to get that project reaching financial close. And I'm sure you and I will be both delighted when it reaches financial close and starts to get built.
Yeah, that's one thing we will agree on. Thanks, Convener.
Thank you, Michael. Malcolm.
This has been very interesting, so thanks very much for that coming in at this stage. I think everything more or less that I wanted to ask has been answered, so I'll just ask one question. I mean, the Vice-Convener helpfully moved it on to the annual charges, because I suppose from the point of view of present and future finance, that's the key issue. So I suppose, you know, a question that the public might be interested in is, what estimate would you make of the savings that, you know, the most up-to-date NPD models make relative to, shall we say, the most up-to-date and comparable PPP, and that would be Scottish PPP rather than the English PFI, because I think that's, I mean, it may be very difficult or impossible to answer that question, but I think it is one that the public would be quite interested in. And I suppose the other question, looking to future finances, is the Cabinet Secretary and the Government have this 5% cap on these revenue payments, although my understanding is that doesn't include local authority payments. But I just wonder what the implications of that are for the future of the MPD programme. Will it have to slow down, or do you think that you will still be able to develop and expand at your current rate within that constraint?
I'd maybe start, and Peter maybe will join in. First of all, it's very difficult to separate out a counterfactual, if you know, a reference point to say what is the difference exactly between old PFI and NPD, because we've changed so much in addition to capping the profits. So, you know, the fact is a fixed return rather than an unbridled profit is a major feature that people tend to focus on. As we've always maintained, the bigger changes we have made beneath the surface equally drive value for money. So the flexibility the public sector get, the community use that the cross-party sports group in sports was talking about last night, these things are incredibly valuable. So doing an exact analysis is very difficult. So for it, just to give you one example, having a public interest director on the board of the company helps the ratings agencies give a more positive rating to a project, which allows it to borrow money, helps the overall rating, which can actually help the financing cost of a project. Now, that's actually something that's a byproduct of NPD rather than the direct thing we sort of factored in, but it's a very useful byproduct. And the belief is that in that relationship with the public interest director and the board, the way in which the contract will operate will be more professional and be more focused around delivering for the public service. So that openness and transparency should lead to better problem solving between both the public and private sectors. So there's a whole series of factors, and just isolating one of them and say, can you just give it on that, is actually very difficult, unfortunately. What I would say across the programme, and Peter may want to come in, is that the different types of financing that's on offer and the financing we're achieving is comparing very favourably. But I never look at value for money in isolation, and actually the construction costs we're getting are actually comparing very favourably as well. So value for money as a whole, I think, is very strong. Do you want to say anything in addition to that, Peter?
Yeah, I suppose you asked about future MPD and the pipeline that's there. We are working on what is a known pipeline, as in the document that we provided to you. So we can't give any comments or observations on anything beyond that. That would be a matter for Minister of the Scottish Government to talk about. But the value on individual financings, as Barry said, is very strong. And I think the cost of finance is improved by not just by the MPD points that Barry's talked about, but by the overall simplification, because financiers are seeing a project where the risks they are exposed to are about the construction and maintenance of a building, which is something they can understand a lot better than, for example, providing cleaning or janitorial services as well. So overall, our projects are seen as less risky by financiers, are higher ratings in general where they are rated, and therefore are driving a lower cost of finance. And that we see also in the amount of competition there is for financing, as Barry said, from different financiers and indeed different financial structures that are out there as these things are at the minute. There's not just one way of doing these things anymore. There's a whole lot of different financiers, and the institutions are offering us very good cost of finance at the minute, which we are taking advantage of across the programme.
Can I maybe just pick up one point which I think was pretty certain was mentioned the last time we were at committee, is that the 5% also includes regulated asset base, historic PFI, PPP, NPD, borrowing powers. I think somebody last time at the committee made the point very clearly, is that, well, it's a control total, it doesn't necessarily mean it's a target. So it is there as a management tool that I think is actually very useful. And I think at UK level, a similar control total has now been introduced as well, where I think it was first introduced here in 2010, I think. So from that point of view, I think it's a very useful control total, but sitting beneath that, there's always an affordability point. What is it we can afford to do within the 5%? And Peter's quite right, in terms of any future NPD, that's very much a matter for ministers to make decisions between borrowing powers, NPD, regulated asset base, and so on and so forth, and we wouldn't wish to second guess their intentions, as you'd imagine.
Okay, thank you. Well, that appears to have exhausted questions from the committee. Is there anything further you would wish to say before we wind up the session?
Thank the committee for their questions, and we will respond to the various points raised in writing as quickly as possible.
Well, it was good to see you again, and thank you very much for answering all our questions. Thank you. I'm now going to call a 5-minute recess to allow members a natural break. Allow the witnesses to leave. here. Call the next item to order when Jean and Michael arrive, which hopefully will be in a minute or two. We're all finally here, so our next item of business, as I restart the session, is to take evidence on the implementation of the Land and Buildings Transaction Tax from Eleanor Emberson of Revenue Scotland and John King of Registers of Scotland. I'd like to welcome our witnesses and thank them for their patience as the other session ran on longer than we anticipated. I'd like to invite one of you to make a brief opening statement.
I don't think we really have an opening statement. I wrote a letter to you just at the beginning of the month with an update as promised to the committee on where we are, and I don't think we've really got anything to add beyond what's in that, just to respond to your questions on it.
After keeping you waiting for so long, I'm mischievous enough to say no questions. But given that you're not going to give us a statement, but I'll kick off with one or two and then we'll see how things progress. I'm sure there'll be a mad rush from colleagues round the committee. Well, first of all, he says, trying to regain his thoughts. In our report, we mentioned that the resource plans for Revenue Scotland are still at a fairly early stage, but Revenue Scotland believe they had made adequate allowance in the plans for what they call compliance activity. So I just wonder, for the record, if you could update us, because although there's a letter which covers some of the issues which will be covered, it's important for the Finance Committee record that these points are highlighted. So I wonder if you can talk to that for a wee minute.
You want to understand, sorry, just so I know what I'm answering, you want to understand what we're doing about compliance?
Yes, indeed.
Yes. I mean, there are many things that might come under the heading of compliance. There are basic things, making sure that payments come in as they should be. There are activities to check that people have not done anything, whether deliberately or accidentally, improper in the way that they've self-assessed for their tax. There's checking up to make sure that nothing has been omitted, so reviewing data sets and understanding what's gone on. We're working through all of that at the moment and deciding what the boundary should be between what Registers of Scotland will do and what Revenue Scotland will do. I mean, there's certain things, because Registers of Scotland will do the frontline collection of the tax and obviously have a lot of experience in the property market because of the nature of what they do, where we can bring their experience to bear to help us with the analysis of transactions and identifying transactions where there might be queries and so on. There'll be other activities if there were any need to pursue, bad debts or just doing analysis of data sets where it's less obvious that it would naturally fall to Registers of Scotland, and so Revenue Scotland would take on that sort of responsibility. So compliance is quite a broad term. We've got a number of different strands of work going on, and some of that, because I know it's of interest to the committee, we're looking at which things are done by Registers and which things are done by Revenue Scotland.
John King, anything you want to add?
I've just really echo what Eleanor has said. I mean, we've always viewed Register of Scotland as having a fairly light touch role in terms of compliance. There's certainly the information and data sharing role, which would we've always envisaged would help Revenue Scotland. Where we see ourselves having maybe a more direct role would be more around the margins, where, for instance, a tax return may be submitted late. So in terms of compliance, it's failed to meet some legislative requirement. There may be the need to issue some kind of notice, could be a penalty notice, for instance. And certainly based on discussions with HMRC, their view is, well, things at that end of the compliance spectrum tend to be automated and tend to be part of the collection system, and that tends to work conveniently both for the tax authority and for the customer. So, a lot of our thinking is around those more de minimis elements of compliance.
Mm-hmm. Now, an issue which came up when it was covered quite extensively in our report was the issue of help desk and guidance, because a lot of the witnesses actually came to us and they said, that the HMRC is just, when you phone up for help and advice, you just don't get it. And there's a real issue of concern about ensuring that we have the appropriate staff, not trained, but also that the public, are actually know who to contact, what number to contact. And so I'm just wondering where we are with that, the issue of providing a one-stop shop, if you like, which I think would be preferable to a two-stop shop in terms of delivering information and advice on LBTT.
I'm going to let John speak to you about the help desk, because we envisage the help desk, main help desk provision being through Registers of Scotland, who indeed already have a help desk on which they can build, because they have one for property transactions. But you also quite correctly raised the issue of guidance in relation to help desk, and these are different facets of the same thing. It's about putting good information out so that as many questions are answered easily for people as possible, so they don't even need to contact a help desk because the answers are all there, but then making sure that there is good help desk provision for any questions that they do have. The main lead on the guidance will obviously be for Revenue Scotland, and we have made a start on that. You will understand that we can't begin to finalise guidance or get all of that in place, because some of the aspects will depend upon not only the Land and Buildings Transaction Tax Act, but also the Revenue Scotland and Tax Powers Bill, which has yet to come in front of the Parliament and indeed in front of this committee. But once that is in front of the committee, we will be pushing on with producing guidance on different aspects. We would expect to make that very easily available, and therefore people will be able to go online or easily get access through their solicitor or their accountant if they're taking advice from their agent on the tax. And then if they still have questions, they'll be able to refer through to help desk. And I might ask John to speak about that.
We've certainly within the LBTT project within Register of Scotland, we've set up a stakeholder group, and that group has two main functions. One is to provide advice and guidance to us on what guidance the profession will need, as Eleanor says, both in writing and also through some access to a help desk. The other aspect of that group is to help us with the system build and development. In terms of the help desk, as a committee will be aware, there's a new Land Registration Act which Parliament passed last year, which will be coming into effect, we anticipate, late next year. We've already identified a need to expand our help desk to ensure a smooth transition from the old system of land registration to the new system. We'll be using that help desk as the basis for the future needs for LBTT as well. And we've done a significant amount of work, both with our stakeholders, also with HMRC, to identify the types of issue that may arise, identify when the need for access to help desk may arise, to again validate some of our initial assumptions around staffing for a help desk. We still feel our initial assumptions remain valid. We take heart from the very positive fact that the LBTT Act is certainly a lot simpler to understand from a customer perspective than is the case with the current SDLT legislation. And that, again, in a way, should reduce the need for access to guidance and to a help desk. But we very much are aware people will want access to a help desk. Historically, whenever Registers has implemented a new piece of legislation, we always issue a lot of guidance. We do a lot of active stakeholder engagement of the kind of one-to-one variety, well, what that tells us is that, yeah, that has a value, but people still want access to help desk. So, I mean, that's very much at the forefront of our thinking. And as Eleanor says, our assumption will be that because of the linkage with land registration, it will come through the ROS help desk. We see our help desk as having the intention being to answer as many questions as we can up front. We recognise there will be some more complex matters, which again would still fall to Registers of Scotland to answer, which would then be referred to a second line system of support. And finally, we recognise there will be very infrequently some particularly complex tax or tax policy matters, which may have to be referred through to colleagues at Revenue Scotland.
Now, you know, I mean, at present, in terms of registration, you just touched on registration there, payment of SDLT is not required, but under LBTT it will be required. So I'm just wondering, you know, given the concerns that were raised in the report on this, where we are with that, with addressing that particular issue.
I'm tremendously sorry, I'm not sure I'm understanding the question. So the concern that...
There's a concern about the payment of registration, that, you know, for LBTT relative to SDLT, and this has been raised. I mean, for example, Pinsent Mason said that this requirement is unnecessarily restrictive, and they're not aware of any evidence to suggest that current approach results in material loss of revenue, and therefore they were asking if it would be reconsidered. So I'm just wondering if there's any further consideration being given to that about when payment is made. In terms of registration. Sorry for not being clear enough.
No. I'm aware of the issue. The requirement, I think, is that the keeper is in fact satisfied that there's a payment arrangement in place, rather than that the cash has transferred. And John may wish to comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, we're certainly aware of some of the comments that were made to yourselves, particularly by the Law Society as well as Pinsent Mason, around this concept of arrangements satisfactory for payment. The Law Society were very keen to enter into dialogue with ourselves in Revenue Scotland as to what that would mean in practice, and we have a stakeholder meeting this coming Friday, and that's one of the issues on the agenda. I mean, we'd be happy to report to the committee after that meeting what the outcome is. We're not anticipating any particular difficulties. Our approach has been there'll be a range of payment options available, which will support that concept of arrangement satisfactory for payment. But certainly what it doesn't mean is that the tax has to be paid at the time they submit their tax return. It just means there have to be satisfactory arrangements in place for the payment, and that can be for the subsequent payment of that tax.
Okay, thanks. Just one final question before I open the session out to the committee. In terms of transitional arrangements, how are negotiations going with HMRC in terms of costs?
They're still underway. I don't have any figure to give you. There's been a lot of careful thought given to what's the best solution at HMRC's end with relation to IT and things, their normal sort of systems development. But we're having regular conversation with them over all of this. It's obviously a matter of great concern to us, so we're still working very closely with them on it.
Do we have any idea when these discussions will be concluded?
I don't think I can give you a date, but obviously there will be a timetable associated with HMRC having to undertake the work at their end to make sure that UK stamp duty land tax is disapplied in Scotland from April 2015. So we need to agree with them in good time, agree the cost in good time for them to undertake the necessary work, and we're alert to that as well. It's not yet a pressing.
What would you mean by good time?
Well, sufficient time to make sure that they are able to deliver what they need to do.
And how long is that, would you think? 3 months, 6 months, 9 months?
They are the people who have to tell me how long it takes to do the IT work at their end, I'm afraid. So I don't think, I mean, I would hope by the next time we're giving the committee an update, we would know. I would hope we would know by then, but because I would imagine that they would be wanting to get to work. But that's my speculation, not their date.
Okay, that is of some concern, but hopefully we'll hear more about that in the not too distant future. I'm going to open up the session to colleagues, and the first person to ask questions will be Deputy Convener. John, to be followed by Gavin.
Thank you, Convener. Yes, one of the points I was going to raise was actually your timeline schedule that you gave us, and one of them was transition arrangements, and one of them was agreement with HMRC. And if I'm reading it correctly, agreement with HMRC started somewhere in July and goes on till somewhere in maybe January or February, so we're kind of halfway through. So is that where we are? Are we halfway through?
I'm not sure in this sort of discussion how you measure a percentage of how far through you are.
Okay.
They have made some proposals, we have commented on them. They have gone away to do some further work. I think I'll know that we are concluded when there is a figure reached that everyone is satisfied with, but we're not there yet.
Right. But agreement with HMRC was targeted to be, say, February, is it? I mean, this is done in quarters, so it looks like February to me.
I mean, as I say, roughly around the time that I might be due to give you another update, which would be another 6 months' time, I guess.
Right. Okay. And the one above that, stakeholders and comms, is split in two bits. There's, first of all, develop the initial comms and engagement, which I think is due to be complete by now, and then it's ongoing engagement. I mean, I don't know if that's a distinct line between the two, but is the initial comms and engagement complete?
Yes, I would say so. You've already heard from John about the stakeholder group which Registers of Scotland have set up. There's a group which is involved not only in land and buildings transaction tax but also in landfill tax, which we've called the Devolved Tax Collaborative, which brings together a range of professional bodies and representatives of firms and groups with an interest, which is now well established, has met 3 times, and will continue to work with right through to April 2015 and beyond on how these taxes should operate and so on. There has been the series of roadshows with the Law Society getting out to the conveyancing profession about land and buildings transaction tax, so that there have been 7 of those around the country. So that's been a sort of initial wide engagement with the conveyancing profession. I think we could say that we've made an effort to get to the main being stakeholders once, at least many times in some cases, and we'll carry on doing that now over the rest of the time up to going live and beyond.
Okay. I mean, your letter, I have to confess that some of the wording of it, I was struggling a wee bit to get below to the kind of meaning. One bit that kind of jumped out at me on the second page of your letter, it says, under respective roles of ROS and RS, final paragraph, it says, it is important that Revenue Scotland and Registers of Scotland take the time to work through the process mapping in detail before reaching a final agreement on the split of responsibilities under live running, if we are to ensure a fully joined up service to taxpayers and their agents. Well, I understand the fully joined up service to taxpayers and their agents. I mean, all of that just sounds like quite a long process, and does something need to actually happen here, or is it just all words?
I apologise for the wording. I was attempting to convey to you that I realise terms like process mapping perhaps seem rather like jargon, but what we have to do is work through when someone is due to pay the tax, what would happen at each stage. And there are many different scenarios. It could be a residential transaction, it could be a commercial transaction. They could have questions, they could have no questions, there could be a dispute, there could be no dispute. So we have to work through what would happen at every step of the process in terms of having to be in contact with members of staff of Registers of Scotland or Revenue Scotland, having to work with an online system to make a payment or register a transaction. Every little detailed bit of how the service would operate, and then unpick. So is that bit best done by Registers of Scotland? Okay. Is that bit best done by Revenue Scotland? What I was attempting to convey was we're coming at it that way by looking at what would a taxpayer do, what would a taxpayer's agent have to do, okay, and who should do which bit with them, rather than by saying, right, Registers of Scotland, the online system's you, Revenue Scotland, you're about disputes. Right. Away you go and develop those two things completely independently.
Well, that's helpful. I mean, that helps me understand it a bit better. So, I mean, presumably, therefore, there's a committee. You can say on a certain date the process mapping will be complete.
Indeed.
At which stage you allocate the responsibilities.
Well, yes.
Yes.
Oh, yes.
Uh-huh. And that's where we're heading.
That's where we're heading, but
right.
You'll understand that absolutely final split will be relatively late in the process.
Right.
We have another big piece of legislation to go through, which will set the framework and the penalties and the powers and duties and various aspects. So we can't be absolutely final until the final set of legislation is in place. But I would say we're developing a pretty good understanding of who's likely to be doing what already. Perhaps John might want to add something.
Not a lot to add, other than it's a lengthy process, very useful process, and just to emphasise, we're also involving our external customers in that process as well, because clearly it will have an impact on them in terms of both what's practical and what their expectations are as well. So a lot of people are involved in this, but it's a fruitful exercise. In practical terms, essentially we have by and large completed the sort of process mapping for key aspects of what would be the tax implications from a residential transaction, and we're working our way through a commercial transaction as well, beginning on that process now. But as Elmer said, we have the other legislation to consider as well, which will have to feed into the work we've done currently.
Okay, that's helpful, thank you. And the third area I wanted to touch on the third page of the letter under the heading Registers of Scotland Progress, it talks about having been assessed, and there was a 5-point scoring matrix, and some things were green and some things were green amber. And in particular, it says the review team concluded that the project was progressing well and that, quote, successful delivery appears probable, unquote. Now, I have to say that was slightly concerned me, because I would hope that the whole thing is going to be slightly more than probable. I do take the point that of the 7 issues to be looked at, some have already been addressed. Could you maybe expand on that section a little bit?
Yeah. I mean, the scoring is just this standard Scottish Government programme and project Centre of Excellence format. So as it explains, it goes from green, which is what you would ideally hope to get. We didn't expect to get green at this stage in the project. That would have been, for the scale of the project, the number of issues which have to be considered, and some of the uncertainties which remain, particularly the Revenue Scotland Tax Powers Bill, it would have been unusual to get a green. So we were delighted that it was a green amber. In terms of there's 7 recommendations, 5 of them have actually been put into place. In terms of the recommendations, they score them as being either critical, so that's for immediate consideration. It's critical, there's essential, or there's recommended. The 2 critical ones were essentially related to internal documentation within Registers of Scotland. There are suggestions for some improvements there, so they've been implemented. 3 other ones have been implemented. The 2 that remain outstanding are 2 recommendations which the team who carried out the review accepted couldn't be tackled at this moment in time, but they wanted to flag them up as being areas of importance for the coming 6 months.
So they're not necessarily things that they thought you should have done already, but some of it's just things that you should be doing in the future.
What they're looking at is the recommendations are, what they concluded was it's a good project, it's running well, it should deliver successfully. We have a number of recommendations which will hopefully actually make it an even better project. And as I say, we've implemented 5. The remaining 2 are recommendations that we need to take forward with Revenue Scotland, and they relate to future system builds, so they're not things we could particularly action at this moment in time anyway.
Okay, thanks very much.
Right, okay, Gavin to be followed by Jamie.
Thank you. Just very briefly on that last point, I think you said you were delighted with Green Amber. What was your sort of expectation?
My expectation was Green Amber, but as the responsible owner for this particular project within Registers of Scotland, what I was looking for out of this independent review was essentially some form of assurance that my interpretation, my take on the project was valid. So it's concluding that in terms of the project, really we are where we would expect to be, and there are no major unidentified issues or particular risks for the project. It also looked at the structure, it looked at the governance supporting the project, it looked at the key areas such as our involvement with stakeholders, it looked at the IT delivery side, and again, what I was looking for was, well, is there anything that is amiss with those areas? And what was coming back from the review team was, no, things are progressing well.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned IT there, so let's come on to IT. I mean, when the bill went through, when the committee stage happened for the bill, I asked a number of questions about the IT budget, which in the financial memorandum was £75,000. But some, maybe new, but somebody from Reg of Scotland said, but you've also got to look at, there was another category which didn't say IT, but I think it was explained to me that underneath that category of about £250,000, the bulk of it was going to be related to IT, which takes you up to about £325,000 or £325,000. Is that budget still realistic? Is it on track, or have there been any changes?
No, it's still a realistic budget. We monitor spend on a monthly basis, and we carry out a more thorough review every quarter. And that review, certainly over the last 6 months, has been looking at particularly the outcome of the LBTT legislation to see whether any of our key assumptions for IT build and development have changed or altered to any significant extent. The budget, we're content that is an accurate assessment of what we think the build cost will be.
Okay, thank you. Question then on the chart, which Mr Mason obviously referred to as well. The first one's IT related, which is the top line. You've got, I suppose, at the far right of that chart, final testing. There's a bar for that. I just wonder if you can explain a little bit about that. Obviously, if one reads too much into the chart, it suggests final testing is going up until April 2015. Obviously beginning, though, a good 6 months before that. Can you give us assurances that most of the final testing will be done well in advance of April 15, and it's simply just, you know, there might be tinkering right at the end, but can you just explain a little bit on how the IT testing will work?
Yeah, I mean, it's essentially it's allowing roughly a 4 or 5 month period from which we have essentially taken delivery of the system, and we provide a degree of public access to that system, so that the public have a degree of familiarisation before LBTT commences in April. Because of the work that's ongoing with stakeholders now, when we essentially take delivery of the system in autumn of next year, we're not anticipating there'll be anything major, but it's certainly IT based practice to road test the system, and we feel we have the benefit of time to actually road test that system. And if there are minor issues, as you say, which we can change quickly, then we would do so. We're not at that stage. We're not really anticipating uncovering anything major, because we've done a lot of formal in-house testing involving stakeholders in advance of that sort of final familiarisation phase.
Okay, thank you. On that same line, I suppose at the left-hand side of that entry, though, you've got data framework agreement, which looks like it should have been finished somewhere between July and October, I would guess kind of August, September. Has that task been completed?
Yes. Yeah, I mean it has, yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
okay.
It encapsulated a number of things, but that work has been undertaken jointly and predominantly by Revenue Scotland with ROS input, but certainly it's, that part of the project is complete.
Sure. Okay. Two other questions, and one is just in relation to the Gateway review. Again, I mean, John Mason asked a number of questions about that. I'm just what I'm struggling to get through is just how you tie up the graph. So the very bottom entry with, I suppose, the narrative, and it's I probably just missed something, but we've got in the narrative this happened, I think, in August. On the graph, you've got something described as GR0 happening at the sort of start of 2013, and then the follow-up reviews happening round about now. Are you able just to talk me what is GR0, and is that something different to what happened in August?
Yes, there was a Gateway review of the overarching programme rather
Okay.
than simply of the project. The project Gateway reviews aren't reflected on the graph.
Right, okay, fine, thank you. And last question, and the answer to this may be no, which is quite fine. But you've talked about, in the letter, the further policy work on subsale relief. You've described there have been 2 stakeholder meetings, things are progressing, and there will be a recommendation or advice provided to the Cabinet Secretary by the end of this year. Are you in a position to elaborate further on that, just about where you think it's headed, or is that, I mean, is it just something that's not available, just or you're not allowed to say at this stage? I'm not trying to get you to say anything you're not allowed to say, but I'm just wondering what is there more that can be said about it?
All I can really tell you is that there have now been, in fact, 3 meetings, and there's another one scheduled shortly.
Sure.
I don't think it would be appropriate to speculate. The group will report and the committee will be informed at the relevant time.
Fair enough. Okay, thanks.
Okay, Jamie.
I'm pretty sure Gavin was trying to get you to say something you were say. I mean, actually, a lot of the ground I'd hoped to cover has been covered by Gavin Hope, tasked with the IT systems and subsales roof. But just from the sense of your letter, I mean, there's obviously a lot of working groups being formed, and we know there's going to be shared responsibility between Revenue Scotland, the Register of Scotland, in relation to this tax, and touching on the landfill tax, because you touch on it here, SEPA have a role to play. So a lot of this is down to relationships for the transitional phase. HMRC will be involved. So can you just tell us, are these relationships good? Are people getting on with one another? Are people working well together?
Yeah, absolutely, from my point of view. The personal relationships work fine. We've got formal structures as well. We've got the usual kind of programme management structures. There's a good programme board which has external representation on it as well. For instance, we have a local authority finance director bringing sort of expertise of having to set up and collect council tax and so on, local taxes. So we've got some good external challenge. We have the range of people involved. So if we were to have any disputes or disagreements, which so far mercifully we have not, we have some arrangements for being able to deal with all of that in a sensible way.
Mr King, I don't know if you have any observations on the
Yeah,
dynamic.
I would agree with that wholeheartedly. Certainly I know the team within Registers of Scotland has a very effective working relationship with the team at Revenue Scotland, and we've also had some positive dialogue with HMRC as well. So on a sort of joined up front, everything's working probably better than one would have anticipated, given you're dealing with a very large organisation south of the border, and a new organisation, but it's going very, very well indeed.
Good, that's reassuring. That's all I've got.
Jean?
It just occurred to me to ask you where people will work, and going forward, is there an opportunity for job dispersal in Scotland?
Obviously, the teams in Registers of Scotland in relation to land and buildings transaction tax, I'll let John answer, but there will be an amount of crossover between people who will not work entirely on tax, but will have responsibilities relating to other things. So that will put a constraint on location. Revenue Scotland itself will be a relatively small body. As we currently envisage it, we might have around 30 staff at the point of going live. That's not obviously just for land and buildings transaction tax. That's also in relation to landfill tax. Our current plan is to base the body in Victoria Quay in Edinburgh, where there is spare capacity in a government building, in the interests of trying to use efficiently the government estate. But the issue of dispersal could be looked at in future. But I would perhaps suggest that it would be where the body is located rather than at that sort of size, whether you would disperse the team very much, because it's not very big in the first place.
Okay, just one last question from me, which is, will Registers of Scotland and Revenue Scotland have a role in forecasting future Scottish tax revenues?
Well, we will have a role to provide data that will underpin the forecast. We won't be the people who will actually carry out the forecasting, but there will be Registers of Scotland have details of property transactions, which I'm sure will be highly relevant to any forecast. Revenue Scotland will, once we are up and running, have data about levels of tax receipts and so on, and all of that will be used to underpin forecasts. But we are not expecting to be the people who are in charge of delivering the forecast.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. Any further points you wish to make at all? No. Well, thank you very much for asking your questions, and once again, sorry for keeping you waiting so long. I also like to thank members of the committee for their work today in asking questions. I look forward to seeing committee members in our growth on Sunday and Monday. That brings the session to a close. Thank you.